Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to History 120, American History up to 1877. This week, well, first of all, I hope everybody had a great spring break. We finished before spring break with information about the American Revolution, and today we need to pick things up with the Confederation government and life in the United States, leading to the era of the United States Constitution. So let's go ahead and get started with that, honestly. I was trying to think if I had any announcements to make, but I don't think I do. What I want to talk about today in this short lecture is land policy for the new nation. And I know that it might sound dull. It may not sound like the most exciting thing in the free world, but honestly, it's going to have a lot of implications for future events and how the West is going to be settled. Now, at this point in time in America's history, the West is anything across the Appalachian Mountains and into the Ohio and Kentucky countries. After the Revolution, we enter a period of time where, as we can kind of see, this is an older image, but it shows the outline of the states. Essentially, we have a period of time where people are between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic seacoast. We're starting to move westward, though. We're starting to expand America's claim to the lands of the North American continent. And one of the things we need to figure out as a people is, what are we going to do with those lands that are not claimed by anybody? And I want to be very careful with that terminology, but I'll be back to it shortly. Empty land is not always empty. As we can see here, in the period of time after the American Revolution, many colonies and the new states had actually claimed lands in the West all the way to the Mississippi River. So imagine looking at this, that Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York State, Virginia, all extended their borders all the way out to the Mississippi. Obviously, they don't anymore, but there was no real strong central government to determine what the actual boundaries of the new nation were, except that the nation ended at the Mississippi River. We also had no conception on how to deal with the public lands. How should sales be handled? How should the land be disposed of? And what should be done with the land in the West? What we do quickly come to the understanding of is that any land that is not claimed by a white American is considered part of what we call the public domain. This means that the national government owns and controls all unsold lands in this country. Now, again, empty land is a dangerous term here. There were Native Americans living on that land. There were French and Spanish people living in these lands who had been part of settlements that were older than the nation of the United States. So we had to be very, very careful in dealing with questions of land disposal. And essentially, the Articles of Confederation do not establish how land sales should be handled or what should be done with the Western territories. And we also need to consider what's going to happen with slavery in this period. What we get is a series of land ordinance laws between 1784 and 1787 that are passed by various Confederation Congresses in an attempt to set out laws that cover how land should be disposed of and how people should have access to lands. We also, the land ordinance of 1784 was purely theoretical. It actually did not create any of the mechanisms needed in order to sell lands or establish new colonial territories. It was written by Jefferson. It created a grand scheme for getting rid of the public domain, but it didn't actually establish any mechanisms. And we need to have legal mechanisms defined in order to sell land in a way that won't be open for dispute. And a great example is land surveying. Um, Prior to the establishment of federal laws requiring the lands to be surveyed, we went by a system that was called metes and bounds, METES and bounds. If you look at the graphic on the screen, we have an example here that shows how metes and bounds played out. Basically, you surveyed your land based on certain landmarks that may or may not actually exist for a long period of time. So let's take this example. If you start at the Great White Oak, you're going to go 15 degrees southwest for 30 chains. A chain is a measuring device used by a surveyor. You're going to go until you hit the felled maple. When you hit the felled maple, you're going to turn your direction to 76 degrees southwest and go for 60 chains. Now, what happens if the maple tree disappears? What happens if the surveyor goes to the wrong maple tree or the wrong portion of the maple tree? Metes and bounds is a very old and very inaccurate means of surveying ground. It uses imaginary or artificial measuring points as locations along this. So if you look at this, like I said, we have the felled maple. Well, we have the marked oak. Which side of the marked oak? Which big rock at the end of chain segment 3 is the landowner talking about? This can be very confusing, and it causes a lot of lawsuits. A lot of the early American judicial system is tied up in trying to rectify what claims are the actual legal land claims that are filed, who's encroaching on people's land, and various lawsuits of dealing with this situation. So that's the old system of surveying land. Under the land ordinances of 1784 and 1785, Jefferson and his fellow members of the Confederation Congress established the public land survey system. And what this does is it establishes the rectilinear survey grid. And actually, I'll have an example on the next slide to talk about it more in depth. But for right now, if you look at the background of the picture, we have the gray squares. Think of those gray squares as being survey lines across the landscape. That's a rectilinear system as opposed to a metes and bounds system. It's a lot more accurate for determining what lands belong to whom. We also have a couple of other important parts of the land ordinance that are established. Section 16, a township is divided into so many sections. The 16th section, or the one closest essentially to the middle of the township, is set aside for the support of education. What this means is that every township and every surveyed township and every surveyed county in the area covered by the land ordinance of 1785 has land automatically set aside for the preservation and support of public education on these lands. For some people, that meant that you built the schoolhouse on section 16, and that's where the kids that lived in that section of the county went to school. For other people, they took section 16 and sold that land and gave the money to the county board or the county commission in order to use for the support of education within that township. This creates a system of accessible public education for families of settlers living in these newly surveyed lands. So that's a major step forward for Enlightenment thinkers like Jefferson and others of the founding generation. Now, there are some limitations on the land ordinance. You need to, at a minimum, you can buy 640 acres for land at sale when you go to purchase land. That's one full section of land. So that's a pretty major piece of real estate, and you have to pay $1 an acre cash for it. So this is actually in some ways going to hurt Western settlement because not a lot of people can afford to pay $640 out of pocket in an age when you're probably talking about between $200 and $300 annual income for a family. Uh, it's going to limit the ability of people to settle in the West because of the size and the price that they have to pay for lands. This is what the let's put that 640 acres in perspective. 640 acres is a section. So if we see the third from the right, that is a full section of land. If you think about most farms in the Midwest, especially if you settled under the Homestead Act much later in our history, we talk about quarter sections, 160 acres. That is that's the one colored in area in that 640 acre square on the illustration here. So 640 acres is a large amount of land. A great example, a lot of people living in towns live on half-acre lots if they own a home. Now imagine how many half-acre lots are in 640 acres. That's 1,280 houses. That's a pretty sizable chunk of land. A township, the next major area up from a section is, pardon me, I'm stumbling a little bit today. You go from a section to a township. And a township, if you see them 36 square miles, each section is 1 mile square. It's 1 mile in each direction from its axis corner. So if we look at this, a township is 36 square miles. It is a square of 6 townships long by 6 townships high. And this is a very ornate, patterned means of disposing of land. It's very attractive to Jefferson. Jefferson is one of these Enlightenment thinkers. He's got to have everything laid out in perfect grids. His gardens are in grids. His journals are in grids. He uses grids to determine what's in season at greengrocers in Washington. He's a very detail-oriented individual. So this is obviously a land disposal system that's made up of by a person who is so deeply detail oriented. And this is how all land in the United States will be disposed of or sold following the Land Ordinance of 1785. Well, why is this important? This is a flyover of South Dakota. You notice when you look it down from a plane flying over South Dakota, everything's nice and square or rectangular, or it's some combination of squares. This is Jefferson's rectilinear survey system put into practice. This is why every farm isn't just a set of different squiggly lines that are all over the place and make it for a confusing map. This is why all your rural gravel roads come to nice 90-degree angles out in the countryside when you're driving. It's all about rectilinearity and having regular borders that make for easy land transfer. The other land ordinance we need to talk about that's also important is the Land Ordinance of 1787, which comes 2 years later, more popularly known as the Northwest Ordinance. And what this does is it establishes the first territory of the United States, which is the Northwest Territory. It's that area between the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. So it's our first territory, but it also establishes the process for admitting new states into the Union. The Northwest Territory will give us essentially all of 5 and parts of a 6th state that will enter the Union at some point prior to 1860. So we have the political process here for expansion, but we also have a political document that bans the existence of slavery north of the Ohio River. So for the first time, we have a legal document ratified by Congress that limits the expansion of slavery. Unfortunately, one of the other aspects that we have to deal with the land ordinance is confusion over native title. As I said, empty land is not empty just because there are no Caucasian people living on it. Native tribes had lived on these lands for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They were migratory and laid claim to several areas of land per tribe, especially for hunting grounds, for agricultural use, or in some cases, permanent villages. And this, while federal policy, or pardon me, while confederated policy does not negate the title of Native Americans to the lands they historically had used, it also assumed that they would either clear that title under legal mechanisms through the government, or they would disappear and that land would be sold and entered into the record by whites as they came forward and established new farms. So natives weren't directly kicked off their land by the land ordinances, but they also kind of assumed that they would eventually either integrate or disappear. And that's problematic for our Western expansion. One second. Sorry about that, little technical problems. One thing to keep in mind, the land ordinances and land disposal, they set themselves perfectly into Jefferson's vision of what America should be. We have this debate in the early republic, and honestly, that debate continues today. Are we a Jeffersonian nation or are we a Hamiltonian nation? Hamilton wants development of business, development of infrastructure, the rise of factories and capital investment as a means of making the United States a great nation that can compete with European powers. Jefferson has a vision of America based on the small farmer. Probably one of the more famous Jeffersonian quotes is that the farmer is the chosen person of God, if there ever was one, because the farmer lives close to the land. He lives a simple agricultural existence. He farms with his own hands. He takes part in the economy only if he has to. He is Jefferson's vision of the perfect American. Unfortunately, the perfect vision of Jefferson's American also goes home at night and reads the Iliad and the Odyssey in the original Greek. He makes everything for himself, or participates in the market as little as humanly possible. He owns 100 acres and a square farm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Jefferson's ideology is beautiful. It doesn't necessarily make for a great reality, except for his land disposal systems. In 1804, during the Jefferson administration, we'll actually see legislation passed that allows people to buy smaller amounts of land, not that full section of 640 acres, but a quarter section of 160 acres. This is to help people have affordable access to farms. It's supposed to set the groundwork for the small individual farmer who owns his own land in fee simple as the basis for what the ideology of American citizenship should be. What is fee simple, you ask? Fee simple is the concept that you pay one purchase price for your land, and then you own that land into perpetuity. It's not like earlier land systems where things were controlled by the father or the eldest brother, and very few people could own lands. You more likely rented lands on a manor or an estate in England. You would never have the ability to purchase land, and no matter how much you worked that land, if you didn't renew your contract, you could lose that land or you could move to another farm. So the concept of fee simple, it's like your car. When you go to the dealership and you buy a car, you buy that car with the expectation that no one else can tell you what to do with that car, that you own that car once it's paid off in perpetuity until you wish to sell it, and you have the right to sell that land. That's fee simple ownership of an automobile. Same thing for the land. it makes land ownership accessible to the average individual. What we also see is land speculation that takes off during this period of time. And we'll deal with the after effects in future lectures, but land speculation is where rich people, investors, people who want to make a lot of money in the real estate market go out and buy that land for $1 an acre, and they then wait for people to move to the area. Everything is bought up, and if you want to buy a farm in the area where speculators have purchased the land, you have to buy the land from the speculators. And the speculators are going to sell you that land for $2 or $3 or $5 an acre, which means that they're making an investment in land, hoping that people are going to move to that area, and that will make them rich when they sell that land off. So that's kind of an overview of land disposal in the early American Republic. Next time, we're going to spend some time talking about the downfall and weaknesses of the Confederation government and the rise of the Constitutional Convention. I hope everybody has a great day.